Today's special guest is Tim Sledge, and he is a humanist writer, author of many secular humanist books, including a Meta-Spiritual Handbook. He is formerly a Southern Baptist minister, and his workbook, Making Peace with Your Past, which was written while he was still Christian, is still used in over 20,000 support groups. So if there was someone in your home growing up who was so emotionally needy that it hindered your healthy development, you are in the right place. Tim Sledge is going to talk to us about identifying the characteristics of growing up in an emotionally unhealthy home and show us how to find forgiveness, healing, and hope from a humanist perspective. Let's put our hands together and welcome Tim Sledge.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's really an honor to be here with you guys today, and I love what I've already experienced with this meeting. Thank you for inviting me. Just want to be, can you guys hear me okay? Thumbs up for, okay, good. All right. Well, so long time ago, 9 years old, I'm in West Texas at the Avenue D Baptist Church. Mr. Reed is my Sunday school teacher, and he's telling us every single Sunday, you need to give your life to Jesus. Well, there's a little bit about hell in there. My parents, my aunts, my uncles, everybody I know feels the same way. You need to give your life to Jesus, and the sooner the better. Don't wait, don't put it off. So finally, one summer during Vacation Bible School, I walked the aisle and sat down at the front and prayed to invite Jesus into my life. And, you know, looking back on it, it was about many things, but one thing it was about being a good boy, really. And that's what I wanted to do. It was actually in the middle of a year in which I was reading the Bible from front to back. I made a New Year's resolution. I had a little chart in the back of my Bible to read from the Old Testament in the morning and the New Testament at night. And that's what I did. It was really confusing, a lot of it. I wasn't sure I understood what begat meant and all sorts of other things, but somehow I got my way through it. And then fast forward, I'm 16 years old. I'm still in Texas, but in another town, Odessa, Texas, the home, and I'm going to the high school now known as the Friday Night Lights School. I'm in a dynamic church, large growing church. The pastor has befriended me and taken an interest in me as he did with many of the youth in our church. And one night during a revival service, I walked the aisle again. And this time I was letting everybody know that I felt God was calling me to preach. Within 2 weeks, I preached my first sermon. Soon I was preaching somewhere in West Texas almost every Sunday. The years passed, I stayed with it. I continued to be faithful to what I perceived as my calling to be a minister for Jesus, and ended up at Wheaton College in Chicago, Illinois. The reason I went to Wheaton College was because that's where Billy Graham went, and I wanted to be the next Billy Graham. After Wheaton College, I went to seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, where I got a master's degree with an emphasis on pastoral care, and then a doctor of ministry degree, and found myself in the early 70s in a church in the suburbs of New York City. Things started happening that surprised me, really actually before I got to the New York City area. In this case, I found after getting to the church that the treasurer of the church was a man who was mentally ill. And the first way I discovered this was when we got there, we moved all the way from Texas to New Jersey. And when we got there, the mover said, well, we need a check for $2,600 to unload your furniture. And I said, no problem. Call the head of the pulpit committee that had called me there. And he called me back and he said, well, there's a little bit of a problem. The treasurer of the church says we didn't authorize to pay for your move. And so a deacon in the church wrote out a check while they worked it all out with this guy who was mentally ill. And along the road, there were many instances like that of what I now call exceptions to the rule of faith. It just didn't work the way it was supposed to more often than one would expect. I would just always file it away somewhere in the back of my head and think, you know, when I have more education, more experience. I'll figure this out. My next church was on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, right out in the desert, beautiful mountains, beautiful sky. And while I was there at this church in Arizona, I got a call. I had a large extended family, 14 different sets of aunts and uncles, half and half, just about on both my mother and my dad's side. And one of my cousins was somebody growing up, I'd always go see him and his grandmother in the summer. And, we were close, we were buddies. And I got a call that my cousin Mike was in a treatment center in Wickenburg, Arizona. And would I go see him? So I did. I'd never been to a treatment center. My father had been an alcoholic, and so alcoholism really made me uncomfortable. But I cared about my cousin, and I went to see him. He was in bad shape. He was still in detox. He looked awful, but he was glad to see me, and I was glad to see him. We actually hadn't talked in, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years. And while I was there, I did what any good Baptist minister would do. I convinced my cousin to get down on his knees and pray to invite Jesus into his life, which he did. I'm not sure that was the treatment that took. I can't really remember now. I think he may have done one more round of treatment, but eventually Mike did become clean and sober. And wow, he became a powerful leader in Austin, Texas, in the recovery community. And he and I, we became close again, starting with that experience meeting at the Meadows in Wickenburg, Arizona. Well, my next move was to Houston, Texas. And it's like I finally found just the right place. My church was in a spot where it could grow. And that's what happened. Over a period of 10 and a half years, my church went from about 500 members to over 2,000 members. We built, I think, 3 or 4 new buildings while I was there. Now, over the years, my cousin Mike, he kept bringing something up to me. He kept saying, Tim, you ought to go to the Meadows because they have a program for ministers where they want ministers to know what they do. So they will let you go free for a week. You just have to pay for your room and food. They want you to learn about it so you'll send people who need to go there. And I always thought, why in the world would I go to the Meadows? Why? And then I'd be nice, but I'd say, well, okay, thanks for telling me. But in 1988, at that time in the 80s, there was a lot of new literature coming out on adult children of alcoholics. And I started reading some of those books and I was connecting with it. As I said earlier, my father had been an alcoholic. And so I decided that I would do a sermon series on adult children of alcoholics. And I decided a great way to prepare for the sermons would be to do what my cousin Mike had asked me to do and actually go to the Meta. So that's what I did. When I got there, I found myself actually in a patient therapy group. Wasn't quite what I expected. And after listening, there were about 7 people in the group. And after listening to the first 4 or 5 people share, hello, my name is Mike. I'm a recovering alcoholic, sex addict, drug addict. Hello, my name is Susie. I've been an active alcoholic for 25 years. And here's what's happened. And on and on. And I was like, what am I doing here? I'm not an alcoholic. These people have serious problems. And I wanted to run away. But I'm not a quitter, so I didn't. As the days unfolded, 2 meetings a day, 2 to 3 hours in the morning, 2 to 3 hours in the afternoon, something started to happen to me. I started to realize that I wasn't nearly as different from these people as I thought. As they talked about their emotional struggles and some of the life issues they were dealing with, I connected. And by Thursday, when it was my time to share, I completely broke down. It was like a lifetime of emotional pain came crashing down on me, but it was also cleansing. And so my 40th birthday was that week, and it was a life-changing week for me. In fact, I left the faith in 2007. And sometimes people ask me, why? And that's my story that I tell in my book, Goodbye, Jesus. But I think if there were one thing that hadn't happened, that maybe I would still be there in church, it would be that week at the Metas, and I'll tell you why. So I went back and I did the sermon series, but I had so much more to share than I had expected. And I decided that I was going to do support groups. My doctoral work and master's work had been in pastoral care, which kind of emphasizes psychology. I'd done my doctoral project around a small group. I'd seen it done at the Metas. I felt like, okay, I can do this. And so I just wanted 5 or 6 people. So I said, come on Thursday night, if you want to be in a group, here's what we'll do. And that night we had about 60 people show up, enough for 6 groups. And so we were off and running. And that was the first round of what became a 3-time-a-year schedule of offering support groups. And in the next 5 years, we had offered a total of maybe something like 90 or 100 groups. And we started seeing something happen consistently. And what we saw happen was that people changed, people grew. And if you went into, when we had special Bible classes on Sunday for the recovery people who were in these groups, and if you were walking down the hallway of the church on a Sunday morning, there's a traditional adult class over here and a recovery class over here, you glance over toward the traditional class, a lot of good things, laughing, slapping each other on the back, telling jokes, talking about the ball game that'll be playing on TV that afternoon. But if you glanced over the recovery group, you'd see people locked in deep conversation. You could just see it even from 15 feet away. You'd see some people crying, you'd see people hugging, and you had a sense that something much deeper was happening in that room. Well, I couldn't avoid this. I started acknowledging to myself, you know, these groups produce more predictable, consistent change in the lives of the people who do them than the change that is supposed to occur when you pray to give your life to Jesus. And that was another exception to the rule of faith. I just tucked it away and kept on going, kept on doing the groups. I started being invited to speak all across the country to help other churches start groups. And we just saw a tremendous response. And over the next couple of decades, something like 20,000 support groups were held using the materials that I ended up writing that we started using in our support groups in our church. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about all the reasons I left faith. That's not the focus of this talk. But when I did leave the faith in 2007, one of the most significant things, as I mentioned earlier, was what I'd seen happening in these groups and how powerful it was. And I had to admit that even though in the book, Making Peace with Your Past, there's always a daily Bible verse to read. And even though we prayed, like at the end of the meeting, those things weren't what really made it work. And so what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk today is, first of all, what were the issues we were addressing? Where did they come from? And what did we learn about helping ourselves and helping each other that can be used in any group, any small group of people, even in friendships? So what got me into this process was and it was a struggle to admit this, but finally admitting my family that I grew up in was a dysfunctional family. And I learned that there's some characteristics of dysfunctional families. Now today, I'm not as comfortable with dysfunctional family as the identifier, because I know how uncomfortable that makes a lot of people, and it slows people down from getting help because they don't want to call their family dysfunctional. I kind of get that more even than I used to. We could talk about family as a high stress family, or we could talk about a family on the more extreme side as a toxic family. But I want to take a different approach today. Let's talk about a, quote, normal family. The label doesn't really matter, but I want to give you 6 characteristics of a kind of family that causes certain predictable results in the children who grow up in such a family. 6 characteristics. We call it a dysfunctional family number one. A dysfunctional family focuses its attention on one emotionally needy family member. Now, this is easy to see if it's an alcoholic, it could be a drug addict, it could be someone who has a personality disorder. It could even be someone who has a severe illness that, and there's nothing, it's not something bad that the person is doing, they can't help it, but there is a legitimate need in this case to focus on this person. But this could happen in a, quote, normal family as well. Number two, a dysfunctional family places limits on the expression of feelings. For example, I met a lot of people who grew up in families where the rule was, you can be angry, but you can't be sad. Or the opposite, you can be sad, but you can't be angry. I've known others where no expression of any intense emotion was okay or normal. A third characteristic of maybe it's a high stress family or a normal family that just has kind of a pocket of dysfunction, discouragement of open talk about obvious problems. In 12-step groups, they talk about the elephant in the living room. My dad's drinking. He was a binge drinker, would go on a binge last weeks or a month. But then maybe for 6 months or longer, life was great. He was a great dad. We never talked about it. We didn't have a family meeting to say, well, how's dad doing with his drinking? And that's common for families that produce what we call adult children. Adult children are children who start acting and thinking like adults while they're still children. And then when they're adults, they're still dealing with unresolved childhood issues. A fourth characteristic is that a family like what we're describing here today, whatever we want to call it, permits destructive roles for the children in the family. Now, in the ideal family, every child gets to be who he, she, they are. It's an emerging thing. But in a dysfunctional family, maybe Mary is the scapegoat. Whatever goes wrong, it's her fault. Maybe Susie is the hero. She is the one who is carrying the honor of the family on her shoulders. There's the clown, daddy's little princess, a lot of different roles, but we're not really made to be, have a predetermined role placed, like across our forehead. Number five, a dysfunctional family, a high stress family, a toxic family, and sometimes a normal family can fail to provide appropriate nurture for developing children. If there's an addict or alcoholism, maybe it's a work addict, which is like an acceptable addiction in many circles. It's that all the attention is going there, or almost all of it. So the child gets sort of pushed aside in terms of their basic needs, to be held, to have time spent with them, to be understood. And finally, and here I am going to use the term dysfunctional family. A dysfunctional family is closed to the outside world. You have a secret and you don't want to talk about it, and you sure don't want anybody else to see it. And this creates a kind of loneliness. Let's talk about some of the responses to growing up in a family that has, let's say, 2 or 3 or more of these characteristics. One is low self-esteem. Closely related to this is shame. Someone said shame is about who we are, guilt is about what we've done. Children, I would feel shame for my dad's drinking. And I remember one time he was on a binge and we came home and somebody, a friend, had a station wagon filled with groceries in the back. They brought us food so we'd have something to eat. And that made me feel ashamed. And one of the problems with addiction, for example, is that the addict is often engaged in a life where they can't own their own shame, and they keep transferring it out to others who, if trained right in the family system, are ready to take on that shame. You may be emotionally shut down. It becomes just too painful to feel all the feelings associated with what's happening in your life and your family. Another thing is waiting for the other shoe to fall. And one thing that this means is that when things are going well, that doesn't feel right. And one of the things my mother told me after my dad died was, when he'd get sober and it would be like several months since he had been on a binge, I would actually start to wish he would do the next one just so it would be over with. It didn't feel right to feel like, okay, everything's okay now. Compulsive behaviors often follow. Sometimes I read at one point that about half of the children of alcoholics become alcoholics. So there may be like an extreme, like for me, it was the extreme response. I didn't drink at all. For others, it may be repeating the same problem or some other addiction. It may be perfectionism. It may be a need to be in control of everything because life really felt out of control. And certainly another characteristic is growing up too soon. Well, we could talk for much longer about the results of growing up in a family that has more than its share of these 6 traits. But let's talk about what we learned made a difference. And, these weren't things we discovered, but we did find a way in a church setting to really make them work. So I want to talk about some of the things that I learned and some of the things that made the group work. And really, what's really neat is I saw you doing one of those things at maybe a little bit different level, but in sharing your joys and sorrows at the beginning of this group today. So these groups that we had, and one of the things that we did is I led some at first, and I had another staff member who was qualified, but we, right off the bat, we started training lay people to do these meetings. So most of the groups over that 5-year period were actually led by lay people who had been in a group, and they watched it done, and they learned. So the first thing that we taught and the first thing that we did was the leader of the group would set the example. And we'd start our first meeting with the leader telling their story. If I was leading a group, I'd tell what it felt like when I was growing up, some of the things that hurt. I would try to get in touch with some of the pain that I felt and some of the issues that occurred in my life as a result. And then we would just go around the circle and let everybody tell their story. One of the things we taught the members of the group was don't give advice. That's not okay. Give feedback. Feedback is, well, when you said that, I felt sad. Or feedback is, I had a similar experience in my life and I can relate to what you said. There's a million ways to give feedback. And once you learn the difference between advice and feedback, it's pretty clear. Not telling the person what to do, and you're not giving, quote, suggestions. Well-intentioned suggestions are often just really destructive. The intentions are good, but the results are not. And so we learn to give feedback, and we learn to create an atmosphere of it's okay to be yourself here. It's okay to be in pain. It's okay that you're hurting. It's okay that you haven't figured out all the answers. And guess what happened in the larger church? Some people liked it, but over time we developed 2 churches. One where every week the people were opening up, being honest, crying, being angry, whatever they felt. And the other where they were going through the motions and practicing the rule of silence about their pain. And 10.5 years into my ministry at that church, and after really our ministry, the Southern Baptist Convention came in and did a video of our groups so that other churches could learn how to do it. But I was forced out as pastor of that church. I talk about it in detail in my book, Goodbye, Jesus, and there were many things involved, but what was not involved was an ethical lapse on my part. A moral failure was not present. It was about church politics. And one of the key issues was those recovery people. I'd started to say our church is a healing place for hurting people. And some of the more traditional members of the church said, well, I'm not a hurting person, and I don't like our church being called that. So one of the things that we learned was that sometimes, and actually I love the song at the opening, but I'm going to say something that's different from part of the message of that song. Sometimes we have to embrace our pain to get rid of it. And some years ago, it's been almost 10 years ago, I found myself single and living alone for the first time in my life. The loneliness was frightening to me. It was like a dark presence, and I would dread it when I felt it coming. One night I was by myself in my house, and I felt that dark loneliness coming after me. And it was all going on in my head. I made a decision. I said, okay, bring it on. Let me have it. I want to feel every aspect of it. And it's like, it's like this black cloud. It just sort of comes, and I sort of embrace it. And that was so empowering. Now, I still felt lonely at other times, but I never had the same fear of that loneliness after that event. And I think this is a powerful message for everybody. It doesn't matter, believer, non-believer, it doesn't really matter. We are made so that if there is something traumatic that happened to us, or if it was chronic in childhood, and we never even admit it, and we never let ourselves feel it, we are expending emotional energy just to keep ourselves in that state. I liken it to somebody who's standing waist deep in water at the beach. And what you can't see is he's got like 6 beach balls he's sort of juggling to keep under the water so they won't pop up out of the water. And that takes a lot of energy. We learned the importance of forgiving. And, it wasn't, you'd have to talk about your parents. It wasn't about hating your parents. It wasn't about anything like that. But it was just about being able to say what happened and how it felt. And then when the work had been done, there was a time for forgiveness. And we also taught people how to bless themselves. I think most children, including adult children, look for a blessing, so to speak, from their parents, and maybe one parent more than the other. How do you define a blessing? Well, it may not be, it's probably hardly ever, I bless you, but it's just a sense, I'm proud of you. I'm good with who you are. I'm good with where you are. And one of the things that we discovered is that sometimes a parent is someone who may never be able to do that. And so we learn to bless each other, and we learn to bless ourselves. What I saw in those groups was so powerful and so consistently life-changing that it became one of the things that convinced me there was nothing there. The good that happened in the groups was propelled by the love and acceptance of the people in those groups. And I believe that very strongly today. But I think these are important concepts and lessons that we all need to understand, even if they don't apply to us. Sometimes it's about understanding somebody else. A lot of advances have been made in psychology and therapy. There are things like EMDR, which works with the movement of your eyes and helping the brain to process trauma. And there are other new techniques like that. And for people who've experienced severe trauma, I recommend professional help. But I also know, because I saw it over and over in many different places across the country, and eventually my book was translated in South Korea. I saw it there. In Peru, same thing. These are issues that relate to how we're made, how we've evolved as human beings. So I hope that something that I've shared today in my story and in these concepts will connect with you in some way. And thank you. Thank you for letting me share. I'll turn it back over to you guys.
All right. Well, let's give a round of applause to today's speaker.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you, Tim.